Good evening if you're joining us live, and if you're not joining us live, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you happen to be or whatever time it happens to be. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm a correspondent governor at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong, and I want to welcome you to this latest in our series of online Zoom events. We've been doing these Zoom events here now for several weeks now. We'll continue, and I want you to please keep an eye on our website. We have a lot of really exciting ones coming up. I can tell you we will have one coming up this coming Wednesday, which is the 12th of August, that you don't want to miss. It's on the new Cold War. It's called Divorce, Decoupling, or Conflict, Sino-American Relations in the New Cold War. We'll have Ling Ling Wei from the Wall Street Journal, who's got a new book out called Superpower Showdown. Mary Gallagher from the University of Michigan, who's an expert on China and runs their China Center, and also Bonnie Glaser from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington will be joining me. I'll be moderating that one. And then on the 18th of August, we will have Stan Grant, who many of you know, a former CNN correspondent. He's one of the first indigenous correspondents on the air in Australia, and he's going to be talking about what the Black Lives Matter movement has meant down under in Australia. But for today, I'm really, really excited to introduce someone who I've known for a very long time. Kishore Mahbubani is very well known. He almost needs no introduction. He's now a distinguished fellow at the Asian Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He's been around for, I hate to say it, 3 decades involved in diplomacy in Singapore, Kishore. And he was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And he was spent over 10 years as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations. I believe that may be where we met, Kishore. So thank you for joining us. And also, you're now the author of a new book. I don't know what number book is this for you, Kishore? It's quite a few, I know.
Number 8. It's a lucky
book number 8. Lucky number 8. And it's got the very provocative title, Has China Won? With a question mark. That's not a declarative statement. It Has China Won? With a question mark. The Chinese challenge to American primacy. And moderating our event tonight with Kishore, our book talk, is going to be our own FCC Club President, Jody Snyder. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jody and get out of your way, and then I'm going to really enjoy this talk.
Great. Thank you, Keith. And just asking everybody, if you would like to send questions, send them to question@fcchk.org. We've got a few already, but please send them there. Again, that's question@fcchk.org. We are also, as Keith noted at the beginning, many of you may be watching this later. We are going to stream this on YouTube, and we'll be at our site, fcchk.org. So thank you, and thank you for joining us, both our audience and our distinguished speaker. And I'll just jump right into the questions. So it's been quite a day here and quite a few weeks and months for the escalation in U.S.-China tensions. The level of tensions and the level of retribution by each side seems to be ratcheting up higher and higher, including the most recent news this afternoon that China is sanctioning U.S. officials after the U.S. sanctioned officials, Hong Kong and Chinese officials, over their role in curtailing political freedoms in Hong Kong, including our chief executive here, Carrie Lam. And of course, today we saw a raid on newspaper offices of Apple Daily, and Jimmy Lai, the founder, arrested quite publicly in frankly quite a shocking display, that raid today. So my question is, what do you make of all this? Is this spiral going to continue? Your book, published just in April, seems to have laid out quite a different scenario than this. What do you, help us understand what's happening from your viewpoint?
Well, I was actually, you're absolutely right. Huh? There has been a tremendous downward spiral since my book came out in April this year. And I was actually hoping that I would be proven wrong, because basically I made a prediction that U.S.-China relations will get worse and worse and worse. You know, that was the prediction. And I was hoping that when COVID-19 intervened, it would prove me wrong, you know, because, you know, traditionally, you know, this is one of the oldest rules of geopolitics. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So in World War II, when Stalin was an enemy of Hitler, Stalin became a good friend of Churchill. because that's how it works. And since COVID-19 is an enemy of the United States, COVID-19 is an enemy of China, logically they should have both come together and said, hey, let's push the pause button on our geopolitical contest. Let's work together to kill COVID-19, and then we can go back to the old business. That would have been logical, rational behavior on the part of the United States and China. What is sad, of course, both countries are suffering from COVID-19, but despite that, they cannot set aside their differences, and things have been going downhill. And so the basic thesis of my book is that the reason why relations will get worse is that they're being driven by structural forces. Let me just quickly mention them, and then we can discuss them later. But the first structural force, of course, is the very old rule in geopolitics that whenever the world's number one emerging power, today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, the world's number one power, always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. And Graham Allison's written a book, Destined for War, which documents this. Secondly, there has always been a fear in the Western psyche of the yellow peril. And I table that. I know those words are not politically correct, they're not discussed, but I want to table them because I think at the end of the day, it explains the emotional responses that are coming out on the US-China contest. And that's why it's important to surface the yellow peril dimension and talk about it openly, because it is a factor in the US-China contest. And thirdly, of course, there's been in the United States a huge expectation, which actually was confirmed by John Bolton when he spoke to you all a few weeks ago. He said on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and the Democrats thought that when the United States engaged China, China would open up economically. And after China opened up economically, China would open up politically. And then, lo and behold, China would become a democracy and US and China could live with each other in peace. Now, of course, as I suggest, it's a somewhat strange expectation that a young republic less than 250 years old believed that when it interacted with a 4,000-year civilization, this young republic of 250 years old would transform the 4,000-year civilization, rather than the 4,000-year civilization transforming the young republic. But this obviously, there was, as John Bolton confirmed, there was this huge expectation, and that's why there's bipartisan support for this US-China contest, and that's why it's getting worse. So it's being driven by structural forces, regardless of the personalities. It's important to emphasize that.
And what do you think, do you think that there's something that one side could do now to kind of stem this spiral? It just seems that, with every passing day, literally, certainly in the last few weeks, we've just seen it ratchet up. And also Hong Kong seems to be caught in the middle. We've had the national security law imposed by China, but even more than that, we seem to be caught in the middle of the US-China tensions. That when the US says, oh, we don't like the national security law, China says, well, what about what you're doing in your own country? And it just ratchets up. And, in the last, 72 hours, we've had sanctioning by name of individuals on both sides, which, again, a few months ago, we all would have thought was kind of crazy. What do you see anything, or would you give advice as a diplomat and a thinker to either side to stop this before it becomes much more dangerous?
I mean, the advice, of course, is the obvious one, and I referred to it already. Frankly, the real problems that the United States is facing today, and I discussed that extensively in my book, is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down. And as you know, COVID-19 has made poverty worse in America. COVID-19 has created much more unemployment in America. COVID-19 has caused a huge economic downturn. So if there were logical, rational people working on this issue, they should, both sides, should press the pause button on the geopolitical contest. I think that's the wisest thing to do. So the question, therefore, is why is it spiraling down now? And I suspect there are many theories, but one theory, and this is, of course, I have to admit, it's a bit speculative. Obviously, I cannot get the evidence for this, but there are people in the Trump administration who may have calculated that we may only have 3 more months in office, that the likelihood is that President Trump is going to lose the elections. Now, what do we want to do to make sure that we do enough damage to the US-China relationship that make it very difficult to turn things around. Because there are actually people who believe that it is in America's interest, and I can understand this, by the way. It's logical, rational behavior, that this is America's last chance to stop China from overtaking the United States. Let's put as many stops as possible before we leave office. And they also believe, and they can make a case for that, that the only reason why China has succeeded is because it relied on the US economy to grow, it relied on US technology to grow. Guess what? We're going to close the doors of the US economy, start a trade war, we're going to cut off US technology to China, and we think that will stop China. And of course, it may happen, but if I was a betting man, I would say this is not likely to happen. So you can see how short-term political forces are also at play. And it's very clear that President Trump himself doesn't seem to have the time and energy to focus on this. He's fighting a very, very strong battle for re-election now. He's clearly sliding domestically. And so that gives a certain degree of free rein to people around him to carry out actions that will obviously bring down. And of course, my advice to China would be to respond with as much restraint as you can. I mean, I can understand why, let's say when the United States closes down Chinese consulate in Houston, the Chinese have to respond and close down a consulate in Chengdu, for the sake of face, whatever it is, they have to do it. But whatever restraint the Chinese could apply, I would say for 3 more months, try to be as restrained as possible and do nothing that would aggravate the situation. That would be my advice to China.
Oh, good advice. I'm going to kind of go on a little bit of a side note before we get back to your book, which I want to discuss in more detail. But so here we're talking about press freedom and that it was a pretty dark day for press freedom in Hong Kong today. Some have said that Singapore could be a place that journalists go. Hong Kong used to be the place where you went, where it was, the most free for the press in Asia. And if that is not any longer the case, Singapore could be, and you're obviously there. Could Singapore be poised to benefit from what's happening in Hong Kong, do you think? Not just with journalists, but with other businesses?
Well, I think certainly from what I hear through the grapevine, Singapore is benefiting to some extent, and many banks and major financial houses have basically frozen their staff in Hong Kong and pushing their growth into Singapore. That's been happening. But I want to emphasize that it is not in Singapore's national interest to see Hong Kong go down. Actually, it is in Singapore's national interest to see Hong Kong thrive. Because, I've been writing about this, there are other larger games at play here. The 21st century is going to be the Asian century. There'll be many growth engines, and we need many financial centers. So it's good to have Singapore and Hong Kong competing with each other. In fact, competition keeps competition in Hong Kong keeps Singapore on its toes. Now, whether or not we can replace Hong Kong in some areas, I would say we cannot replace Hong Kong in all areas. For example, you mentioned we do have, as you know, lots of major media channels based in Singapore. You have BBC. In fact, I can turn on the BBC radio 24 hours a day on my local FM channel. We have Bloomberg. We have CNBC studios in Singapore. But at the same time, I think, Singapore has also got to worry a bit. I'll be very frank with you about how our neighbors react to all this. And if I can give an analogy, delicate, politically sensitive analogy, as you know, when Qatar set up Al Jazeera, you saw how its neighbors reacted. So Singapore has also got to be sensitive to that dimension. Fortunately, we are very independent and we can do what we want, but nonetheless, we have to be politically sensitive about these areas.
Okay, well, back to your book. So the question about your book is also the title of your book, Why Has China Won? Tell us about that question. And frankly, it doesn't look like either the US or China is winning at the moment. So tell us why you chose that question, and is that still the right question?
Well, I tell you what's hiding behind the question, has China won? It's another question. And the other question, of course, is can America lose? And as you know, that question never surfaces in America at all. America assumes, and maybe for good reason, by the way, you know, it's important to understand that the two countries, China and United States, as they're coming to interact with each other, they're being driven by their respective histories. And in the case of China, what is dominant in the Chinese mindset is 100 years of humiliation. As you know, from 1842, the First Opium War, which led to the British colonization of Hong Kong, and right up to the defeat by the Japanese, the settlements in Shanghai, the invasion by Japan. So the Chinese suffered a lot. So the Chinese, therefore, want to make sure that this doesn't happen again, right? So for the Chinese, it's a life and death matter because of the century of humiliation. And for the United States, has enjoyed a century of triumph. From Teddy Roosevelt of the 1890s, when America became strong and muscular. And as you know, Teddy Roosevelt declared war, seized the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, everything, you know. So, and then you had triumph after triumph. You defeated Germany in World War I. You won World War II handsomely. You fought off the Japanese economic challenge, and then you defeated the Soviet Union without firing a shot. So Americans have got used to the idea of winning. So the idea of losing just doesn't appear in the American mind. But as you know, I begin the book by talking about a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger. And after the one-on-one lunch, I went back and I thought about it. What's the message what Henry Kissinger was trying to convey to me? And as I say in the book, the message he was trying to convey to me is that America has launched this geopolitical contest without working out a comprehensive long-term strategy to deal with China. And it assumes, because it's got so used to winning, the idea of losing doesn't come up, and it goes right ahead with this. And I think this is unwise. I mean, and so I'm speaking here as a friend of America. I say, maybe you should think twice, you know. The reason I asked about has China won, I want to at least ask the question, is it conceivable that for the first time in 100 years, that the United States could potentially lose? Now, lose doesn't mean losing a war, you know. Lose could mean that the US economy, which has been number one for 130, 140 years, could become number two. And that's very, very conceivable. And by the way, if you did a straight line extrapolation of how much the US economy went down in the second quarter, and on an annualized basis of 30%, now it ain't going to happen, by the way. It won't be annualized at 30%. It'll be annualized at -7, -10%. But can you imagine if China goes for a V-shaped recovery and the US goes down, guess what? The relativity between US and China will change significantly. So it is perfectly conceivable that the United States could become the number 2 economy in the world. But you know, no politician in office in the United States can utter the words, let's prepare for becoming number 2. And so that's why my book, at the end of the day, is a gift to the United States, America, to say, hey, this is a realistic possibility. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but I can prepare. If you give me reasonable odds, I might take bets. It's going to happen. And then when it happens, how does the world change? But I think I do conclude the book by saying, at the end of the day, my big recommendation is that US and China can work together if they really want to improve the well-being of their people. But that's, of course, my optimistic conclusion. But to answer your question specifically, I'm trying to be helpful to my friends in America by saying, why didn't you at least think about the possibility that you might become the number 2 economy? Now, what happens in that kind of world?
Interesting. Well, the one thing that the U.S. sadly is number 1 in right now is deaths and cases from the coronavirus. Almost a quarter of all deaths and cases have occurred in the U.S. when what the U.S. has about 4% of the world's population. So clearly, this is not a number one status the U.S. has been going for. I want to talk to you about the pandemic. It obviously started in China, but President Trump has been trying to deflect the blame from his handling of the crisis. Some are saying woeful handling of the crisis, and he wants to blame China. How much of this do you think will stick? And what is, what should China be doing on the world stage, given that the virus started there quite clearly? Tell us about the geopolitics between the two countries of the virus right now.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, obviously this virus is a great tragedy, and all of us, frankly, the logical thing we should, as I said at the very beginning, we should all be coming together to fight COVID-19. And there's no question that China made mistakes at the very beginning in its management of COVID-19, and this is the fact. But this is also, by the way, normal. When a new virus emerges, I'm told by my medical friends, you can never really tell how serious it is, right away. You see people dying, but you're not sure what exactly is this, where does it come from? It took them some time to establish all that. But there's also no doubt that the Lancet magazine, the editor of Lancet magazine, Richard Horton, published 5 articles at the end of January pointing out there's a new virus. It is spreading through people-to-people contact. You need to prepare for it. You need to have PPEs. You need to, that people will be dying in numbers. And so all the warnings were given. And the reality is, and Richard Horton says this, editor of Lancet, the warnings were given in January, but nothing was done in the United States until the end of March. And I can tell you, this is something that has really shocked the world, because the United States has always been seen as the scientific superpower of the world. And it still is, by the way. I want to emphasize this. The United States is still the scientific superpower of the world, no question whatsoever, number one in that field. And yet for the scientific superpower in the world to be so incompetent, in its management of this issue is actually quite shocking. And the most basic thing you need to do, by the way, is wear a mask. Seriously, you can really save your life by wearing a mask. But when the president of the country refuses to wear a mask for a long time, can you imagine how many lives are affected by that? So that's why it's important to make it clear that even though China did make mistakes in the beginning, the subsequent reactions show that clearly that something was done right in China, and not just in China, in East Asia. Let me give you one statistic which everybody should know. The number of deaths per million from COVID-19, per million of population, throughout East Asia, okay, not just China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, everywhere, Australia, New Zealand, is less than 10. The same number in Europe is in the hundreds, and in the United States is in the hundreds. So it is not just China, that East Asian countries, somehow or other, I don't understand why exactly, have so far managed COVID-19 better than the Western countries have done. So one of the points I always keep making, why don't you come and learn from East Asia and see what we have done right? I mean, just try and figure out what we have done right, because this is quite stunning, and this is something unexpected, but this has happened.
Well, partly fear of SARS in this part of the world too, I think, right? I mean, they had already dealt with this, and the U.S. sort of thought, oh, it doesn't happen here, and then, of course, it has. Well, we have a few questions. One from my colleague and friend Keith, so I'll ask these. You seem to put a lot of blame for the deterioration of the U.S.-China relationship on the Trump administration and maybe the hardliners around President Trump. How much blame does China share for some provocative actions like its military moves in the South China Sea? And aren't there also some hardliners in China that want a confrontation with the U.S.?
Well, certainly. I want to emphasize, in any geopolitical contest, it is never the case that one side is right, the other side is wrong. And as I emphasize in my book, both sides have made mistakes. In fact, I devote a whole chapter on China's biggest strategic mistake. And China's biggest strategic mistake, as I explained in the book, was to alienate the American business community. And in the past, in the 1990s, even 2000s, whenever US-China relations started to slide downhill, the US business community will be the first to speak out and say, stop, 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 stop. China is the biggest growing market for us. Please don't intervene in it. Of course, you know, Boeing has benefited, General Motors has benefited from the China market. But what's interesting is that when Trump finally launched his trade war in 2017, everybody kept quiet. All the entire business community kept quiet in the United States. And that was a sign what a big mistake the Chinese had made. And the complaints, as you know, are well known. I document them in the book. They accuse China of, you know, stealing intellectual property, forcing forced technology transfer, don't abide by agreements that are made, you know, and so on and so forth. So there have been lots of mistakes that China has made. And I think China should learn very carefully from the mistakes they made in alienating the US business community. And that, I think, is a fundamental mistake that they made. And I also agree that they've become more assertive on the South China Sea. And I think that's also been unwise in that area. And that caused not just concern in the United States, that's also caused concern among the ASEAN countries also. So yes, China has made mistakes too. It's never the case that one side is right, the other side is wrong.
Well, we have another question here from Kevin Ding, a new associate member of the FCC, and a great reason to be an FCC member. You get to ask questions of big thinkers like you. In what direction of the current battle between the US and China is that's moving toward more like US, in what direction is the US-China battle moving toward? Is it more like the US trade currency war in the 1980s or the Cold War with the Soviet Union? And he has a follow-up once you answer that.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's very dangerous to use analogies from the past. And that's what my book does, to explain what's going on within US and China. So the Cold War analogy is dead wrong. It's only partially right in the sense that there's a contest within two superpowers. But you know, as you know, in the Cold War within the United States and Soviet Union, there was hardly any trade within the United States and Soviet Union. There's massive amount of trade within the United States and China. Hardly any Russians went to, or Soviet citizens went to study in American universities. Now you have 300,000 Chinese students studying in American universities. So the level of interdependence between the United States and China is very, very significant. And so, for example, I mean, there are some people in the United States who believe that they can try to decouple the US economy from China. But if they decouple the US economy from China, they'll find that China is actually very integrated with the rest of the world. And the US will end up decoupling from a large part of the world, because for over 120 countries in the world do more trade with China than they do with the United States of America. And that's why it's very, very dangerous to use old and Cold War analogies or other analogies, because the US-China contest is very, very different. And the other point I want to emphasize is that unlike the Soviet Union, which actually, as you know, Khrushchev famously said, we will bury you and the world will see that communism is the future. And the Soviet Union was exporting communism. So there was a deep ideological rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union. Now, China actually is not exporting communism. China is not asking any country to become communist. In fact, after Mr. Deng Xiaoping met Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in 1978 in Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, we in Southeast Asia want to be friends with China, but if you are supporting the communist parties in Southeast Asia, how can we become friends of China? So you notice a few months later, all the support stopped. So since 1978, which is now 42 years ago, China stopped supporting communist parties. So there isn't the same kind of ideological battle. And the thing to understand is that China's goals are very different from the goals of the Soviet Union. And China's goals are essentially to revive Chinese civilization and make it strong again. And if the goal is to revive Chinese civilization, there is no zero-sum game between the United States and China in that area, because you can have a strong American civilization, a strong Chinese civilization, and that's why the Cold War analogy again doesn't work. So that's why it's important for me to write this book to explain that please don't use the spectacles from the past to understand the future.
What should we be calling it, though? We all keep calling it a Cold War. What would be a better phrase?
Well, I mean, there's no easy pat phrase, but I would say it is becoming not a clash of civilizations, but a test of resilience of civilizations. And the Chinese—
That's not very catchy.
No, it's not
It'd be
very
hard to do in a soundbite.
That's why I chose a catchy title as China One. Which you agree is catchy.
That's good. That's catchy. Yeah, that's good. So in the second part of the question was, what is the greatest danger to China in this battle with the U.S.?
Well, I mean, to put it bluntly, China can lose.
Yeah.
I mean, since the United States has won every contest, that's why, I begin the book with a fictional memo from one of President Xi Jinping's colleagues to President Xi Jinping saying, we are now embarked on a great contest with the United States. China will, of course, win, but whatever we do, China must never underestimate the United States of America. The United States still remains the most powerful country that human history has ever seen. The amount of power the United States has accumulated far exceeds what the Roman Empire had. No country has come close to developing the kind of comprehensive power that the United States has obtained. Not just economic power, it's economic power, cultural power, political attractiveness, soft power. So it's a very multi-dimensional power that the United States has. As I point out in the book, China is very lucky. It can harvest the best brains from 1.4 billion people in China. But guess what? The United States can harvest the best brains from 7.8 billion people in the world who come and who live and work in China. And two of America's largest corporations, Google and Microsoft, are being run by migrant Indians who were born in India. There's no Chinese corporation that is run by a non-Chinese. So the contest doesn't mean that China is going to win at all. No, and the Chinese should work on the assumption that the United States could win, certainly. And I think that's what I try to warn also in the book.
Another question, this is from Al Reyes with the Asia Global Institute. He asked, how do you see the China-India relationship, interesting because you just mentioned India, after the deadly border clash in June? Do you see India building a stronger strategic alliance with the US, which Washington would welcome?
Well, certainly until a few weeks ago, there was sadly, as you know, a clash at the China-India border, and the anti-China sentiment in India has shot through the roof. I discovered it personally. I appeared on an Indian TV show and tried to counsel moderation, and I discovered that I got eaten up.
They didn't like that.
I'm not exaggerating. By the Indians. They were so angry towards China. So the anger in India towards China is very, very real. And so India is clearly sliding towards a more pro-US position. But at the same time, the oldest rule in geopolitics is that countries that make geopolitical decisions when they're driven by emotions always end up in problems. And so it's better for India to do a very cold-blooded geopolitical calculation as to where India will stand best. And now the primary contest is between the United States and China, which it is, by the way. The best geopolitical position for India to take is to stay in the middle of a seesaw. Can you imagine China on one side, India on the other side? If India stands in the middle, wherever India puts its foot, it affects the seesaw. So India could become a bold, independent player. And there are voices in India calling for that too. So, but right now, given the emotions in India, towards United States. India is moving towards the United States. But the tragedy here, as I actually wrote somewhere recently, is that the paradox is that when China engaged the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, United States was a strong, self-confident country and very generous, very generous. It opens in markets to Chinese products, and China took off thanks to the American market. So today, if the Indians want to export to United States, the doors are shut. The doors are shut. The United States cannot sign a free trade agreement with India because it will be politically toxic. I mean, if NAFTA gets into problems with Canada and Mexico, can you imagine a free trade agreement between India and United States? And at the same time that India had its border clash with United States, the Trump administration canceled H-1B visas.
Right.
Guess what? 20,000 Indians, then couldn't get to United States. So India is therefore, unlike China, which benefited from a very generous United States of America, India has to deal with the United States of America, which, as you know, I document in my book, because there's a huge anger towards globalization, anger towards free trade. So the doors will not open for India in the same way that they open for China.
I'd like to move around the region a little bit more, and given your Singaporean background and heritage, I'd like to ask you a question about politics there. And we obviously know the main party won handsomely in the recent elections, though the opposition had historically big gains. Some people there think this signals a possible change in leadership with younger people going for the opposition, and it's just a matter of time. And others say, when you compare this to any place else in the world, they won pretty big. What lessons do you take from the recent Singapore election?
Well, it was definitely a very significant election. It will be seen as a landmark election in the history of Singapore, because I can tell you what the conventional wisdom was, and I'll be very honest, I believe the conventional wisdom. I thought that because of COVID-19, the Singapore was hit very, very badly by COVID-19. Singapore was one of the biggest, had one of the biggest damage done because, we are the most globalized economy in the world. We depend on tourism, we depend on aviation. So our economy is very badly hit by COVID-19. And when in a crisis, there is what they call a flight to safety. And the logical response should have been for in the last election, 2015, the government got 70% of the vote. So you would assume that we get close to 70% or between 65 to 70%. That would have been the logical result. Instead, the vote fell to 61%, 9% drop, which is quite significant, by the way. And at the same time, and this is much more important, the government had never lost more than what they call a group representative constituency, GRC, but now they lost 2. I was completely surprised. I thought, wow, I never thought the PAP would lose 2 GRCs. I thought they would lose 1, but not 2. So there's a signs clearly of a new political winds blowing in Singapore. And so, but if we move towards, we are very far away from a 2-party system. Out of 93 seats, 83 seats are with the ruling party, the People's Action Party, 10 with the Workers' Party. But one of the best things the Prime Minister did, by the way, and I'm glad he did it immediately. On election night, he immediately announced, well, since the opposition won 10 seats, we'll now have a leader of the opposition. Now, we never, ever had a leader of the opposition in Singapore, and now we have one. And I think it's important to accept change, and I think Singapore is ready to accept a very different political environment that is coming, which is inevitable when you have a middle class, a young population, aspirational population. All this is happening. But these are all, by the way, positive developments. They're not negative developments.
Back to the US and China. If President Trump is not reelected in November, and the polls at this point are in favor of his opponent, do you think we will see a return to the relationship that the US and China seem to enjoy before the past year? Or will we have something in between the current, I won't say Cold War because we're trying to find another name, but different than what we have now? Or have things changed so much that we are going to have a different relationship going forward, no matter who is the occupant at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, I think the answer to your question depends on whether or not the new administration reads my book.
Okay.
If they read my book, I actually recommend a wiser course of action. It doesn't mean that the contest ends, by the way, you know, but they can still work together despite the contest. And at the end of the day, I think, frankly, you know, one of the contribution my book makes, which is different from other books, is that it points out that the United States has serious structural issues to deal with. I mean, of a scale that it's never had to face before. It never had a situation where the average income of the bottom 50% went down over a 30-year period, and two Princeton University economists, Case and Deaton, have documented how this has created a sea of despair among the white working classes. So America has got very serious domestic challenges to deal with. And I would say give priority to that. And so for that reason, and also because we face also, the second reason I give is that we face many common global challenges. COVID-19 is one of them, and global warming is the other. And you can't solve global warming if you don't, if China is not part of the solution for global warming, China becomes part of the problem of global warming. So you need China for that too. So there are good reasons why they need to get along. But of course, they can never go back to the past. Okay, there was a kind of a overall relatively harmonious relationship between the United States and China. And I think it's perfectly understandable for the United States to feel very troubled about losing its number one economy in the world. So as you know, there is a very strong bipartisan consensus in the United States. Now, I'm confident that President Joe Biden will be more courteous, I would say, towards China. But I think at the same time, in some ways, China will have to deal with a more formidable United States, because many of the allies, as you know, who have become disenchanted with the Trump administration. Exhibit A is Germany, okay? Angela Merkel. So Angela Merkel will be very, very happy to work with Joe Biden. Very happy. She's obviously not happy working with President Trump. So all the allies that began to drift away, and you know, unlike the Cold, that's why, and the other reason why I say the Cold War analogy doesn't work is that in the Cold War, many of America's allies were as enthusiastic, or not more enthusiastic than the United States in taking on the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Very large third world countries like Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia joined the American side. Today, you notice almost no country is rushing to join the United States side in this contest against China. But under Joe Biden, I think things will change. And so there will be China will be dealing with a more courteous United States, but also a more formidable United States under Joe Biden.
We have another question. This is from Kristen Oberger. She asks, China's GDP may surpass the United States, but China has 4 times the number of people. It also has a rapidly aging population, a polluted environment, and other problems. At one point, can you really say China is winning against the US?
Well, I completely agree that China has got continues to have serious domestic challenges. Aging population is one of them, environmental challenges another. And that's why, I mean, as you know, just to be very clear, the Chinese are not enthusiastic about this geopolitical contest with the United States. The Chinese government still wants to focus its attention on its domestic growth and domestic development. And to be fair to the Chinese government, they've overall done a very, very good job. One of the important statistics to know about China is that the last 40 years, the Chinese people have seen a greater improvement in their standard of living in the past 40 years than they've seen in 4,000 years of Chinese history. And I want to emphasize that because, and so that the Chinese therefore are very focused on trying to improve the livelihood of their people, and they are prepared to make compromises, I think, to push the geopolitical contests on the side. But of course, if they are forced to engage in the contest, they will respond. But they will respond with a careful, long-term strategy. And in fact, that was also another point that I picked up in my lunch with Henry Kissinger, which is also which you can also find in the book by Henry Kissinger on China, where the Chinese play a game of Go and the Americans play a game of chess. And the game of Go is very different. You very slowly, patiently push the odds on your side without trying to go for any decisive short-term actions. So it's a different game. And so it's important for the United States, therefore, to understand the game that China is playing and then adapt and adjust and see how the United States can win at that game too.
I wanted to ask a Hong Kong question, since that we're sitting right here in Hong Kong, and the national security law, which just took effect on July 1st, which, as we all know, is a very broad law that we're all just trying to figure out still. It could apply in a lot of ways. It's written very broadly and somewhat vaguely and very different than what we're used to in Hong Kong. How do you see this? And do you see, perhaps because of this law and the possible effects of it, could China have sort of overreached in terms of hurting the economy here, sort of killing the goose that laid the golden egg in Hong Kong, which requires on a fair, free, open environment in which, for instance, to trade information because it's such a financial community? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yes. Well, I mean, I hope you don't mind if I'm a bit frank, because I think, you know, I'm a friend of Hong Kong. I love Hong Kong. And I want the people of Hong Kong to survive and do well. But there's one of the saddest truths of geopolitics is that when two elephants fight, right, the most dangerous place to be is in the middle. And Hong Kong has become a political football. And let's be very clear about that dispassionately. It's a political football. And as you know, when players play football, they get a lot of fun kicking the ball, but after a while, the ball breaks down. So it's important for Hong Kong to steer itself out of being a political football as much as possible. The second point, you use a very important word. You said, the golden egg, right? And I want to emphasize that Hong Kong used to be the golden egg. In fact, in 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China from British colonial rule, Hong Kong's GNP was 20% of China's GNP, 20%, 1/5. Today, Hong Kong is about 2 or 3% of China's GNP and will progressively become smaller as China grows faster than Hong Kong. So it's no longer the kind of golden egg that is indispensable for Hong Kong. And at the same time, I think, and this is a very delicate point I want to make, that the people in Hong Kong should not force the leaders to choose between the interests of 1.4 billion people in China and 7 million people in Hong Kong. Now, if the troubles or unrest in Hong Kong don't affect the 1.4 billion people, and so far they haven't, China can be quite restrained. But if indeed the troubles in Hong Kong affect the stability of China, then any government in China, including, frankly, even the United States government, would say the interest of the majority of the population is more important than the interests of 7 million. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that all great powers, when they deal with troublesome little states, use their force. I mean, I can give you two examples. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan wrote a joint letter to the most Anglophone Prime Minister in the world, Jawaharlal Nehru, and said, Prime Minister Nehru, please don't invade Goa. You know, the Portuguese would like to keep it. So within 24 hours of getting a letter, Nehru invaded Goa. You know, because I mean, Goa at the end of the day belongs to India. It doesn't belong to Portugal, and Hong Kong belongs to China. It doesn't belong to the UK. I mean, these are the hard realities. So, but you don't want to force people. And the United States, as you know, invaded Grenada when Grenada became very difficult. So this is what great powers do. So I want to emphasize that the people of Hong Kong also have to be very, very realistic about the long-term options that they have. And it's in their interest to find ways and means of living with a very, very large China. And I would say on the part of the national security law, if I had to give one piece of advice to China, I would say apply it very carefully, in a very careful, restrained fashion. Because the worst thing is to use it too much, and then you will upset everyone. And of course, it is a fact, by the way. And again, I'm not a Hong Kong expert. I understand under the basic law, a national security law is actually ordained. So it's not something that's surprising.
Yeah, one thing, and then I'll move on. I have a couple more questions, but you had mentioned that Hong Kong, I think it's about 4% of China's GDP, between 3 and 4%, but it is more than half of FDI, foreign direct investment, which is an interesting figure. And that's where I wonder, that's more what my question was about, whether China overstepping. This is still the place where a lot of foreign investment flows through.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't go through Hong Kong and it goes someplace else, i.e. Singapore, Japan, other places, is that then a deficit for the mainland?
But I think you also know that a lot of the investment from Hong Kong is recycled Chinese money.
Yes, that's true.
And I think the recycling Chinese money will go back into China. And at the end of the day, one thing I've learned about businessmen is that they're the most pragmatic people in the world. They will go to where they can get the highest returns. And if the Chinese economy keeps growing at even 5-6% a year, in this growth, there's a tipping point, right? I think you're aware of that. And China's at the tipping point where it is like, it already has the world's largest middle class, but it's actually going to explode in terms of consumption power. And so as a result of that, you're looking for the world's biggest market. You're a businessman. You want a return on your money, right? Where do you go? You go to where the markets are. And the market is in China today. It's a reality. And so the money will eventually, even if they cannot go in through Hong Kong, they'll find other ways and means of going into China. So I don't think investment in China will go down. And by the way, even when the Japanese and all, if the Japanese reduce their investments in China, as they're trying to do so, if they invest in Southeast Asia, the economies grow, guess what? the China and Southeast Asia are major trading partners. So yes, as Southeast Asia grows, China's economy will grow too. So it's not necessarily zero. The key point here is that it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. That money will find its way, and the growth will continue in this region.
Okay, we have two questions. One is from Wei Du, who asks, you've been very critical of the US, but not so much of China. Do you think China's recent moves in Hong Kong are playing well anywhere in the world? So a little bit of a follow on the question I just asked you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess, my role is to, the way I can help is to be objective and address the specific questions and give specific answers. And I would say on Hong Kong, I'm going to add a very important statistic. Out of 7.8 billion people in the world, 12% lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. 88%. The Hong Kong issue has become an issue of concern for the 12% of the world's population who live in the West. And let's say if you go to Africa and you talk to the Africans who've been colonized by the British and the French and the German and the Portuguese and everyone, their attitude is actually quite simple. This was a British colony that belonged to China. It has to go back to China, right? So, I know that the Western media is very loud and dominant in the world. So you get the impression, the whole world is turning on Hong Kong. And as I mentioned to you, if India was in the same shoes and there was a British colony today, ex-British colony on Indian soil, India would take it back. That's what countries do. And that's the rule. And India even took Sikkim, right? So let's be very, very clear that the colonial rule is illegal, illegitimate. And I'm going to say something that may shock many of you people. You know, in 2042, you will celebrate the 200th anniversary of the secession of Hong Kong. Don't be surprised if China at that stage asks for reparations. And I'll give you a leading indicator. In India, which is a democratic country, right? Let's listen to Shashi Tharoor. What does he say? He says it's time for the UK, at least symbolically, to make reparations to India, because you know UK exploited India for how many years, right? And extracted so much wealth from India, so much wealth. So you know, so you must look at the historical cycle we are at, and so the Western perspective on Hong Kong, therefore, is very different from the perspective of countries which were colonized, right, and suffered colonial rule. So they don't see the West as necessarily the best moral guardians of what to do with colonized territories. I hope you get this point. That
yeah,
it's very
interesting. Well, we have one more Hong Kong question, and then I have a quick final question for you, as we have just a few more minutes. This comes from FCC member Richard Ward, who's asking, do you think China is trying to eradicate Hong Kong's separate culture and identity? What is the intention of China here?
I hope not. It would be a huge mistake on the part of China to try and eradicate what makes Hong Kong so special. And even though the Chinese have tried very hard to get Shanghai to grow as a financial center, you can see that Shanghai just cannot keep doing what Hong Kong is doing. So Hong Kong is really, at the end of the day, a piece of treasure for China. And it would be a huge mistake for China to destroy that culture, that separateness, and so on and so forth. And by the way, for the same reason also, I think it's also a huge mistake for even the West, United States, UK and all, to continue using Hong Kong as a political football. Actually, it's in the global interest for Hong Kong to be one step in, one step out as part of the one country, two systems thing. And we should globally recognize that good for China, good for the West, and good for the world. So yes, I would say there will be a huge mistake to destroy the special identity of Hong Kong, which I love.
All right, and when my last question is, it's summertime. We're asking this of a number of our guests. What are you reading besides your own book? What are you reading, and that you would recommend to us?
That's a good question. I actually have been thinking of going back to reading novels again. But I'll be honest with you, I'm now working on a multiple open online course, a MOOC course on US-China relations based on my book. And it's been the most difficult thing I've done in years.
So you don't have time to read.
So I'm actually very focused on finishing the MOOC course. And this discussion, of course, always gives me new ideas also for my MOOC course.
All right, so no titles that you think we should put on our summer reading list. And we can't go to the beach or anything, but you know, anything we should read in our spare time.
I'm trying very hard to. Well, if you want me to recommend a novel to read, which actually helps you understand Singapore, written by a good friend of mine, Mira Chan, it's called A Different Sky. And it's a good book to read, and maybe for people in Hong Kong, because it shows how Singapore really struggled. Really, Singapore went through quite massive struggle. When I grew up as a child in Singapore, I didn't have a flush toilet. I was put on a special feeding program when I was 6 years old. There were racial riots in my neighborhood. I saw gangsters cutting up each other with beer bottles, broken beer bottles. It's a very different Singapore that I grew up in, So for me, the transformation of Singapore is an amazing story, and I'm very grateful that I lived through it. But if you want a sense of how really Singapore was just like a typical third world country. And it's a great novel to read. It's very well written. It's called A Different Sky by Miracha.
Great. Well, I'm putting it on my list, definitely. So thank you for that. And thank you for spending this time with us and answering our questions and such a wide-ranging discussion. And at some point when we're allowed to all travel again, and we'd love to have you speak to us in person at the club. So consider that an open invitation.
I really miss Hong Kong. I do.
Well, we look forward to having you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.